January 2013. The small town of Theale, West Berkshire has just announced plans for this, a new railway bridge. While not particularly remarkable, it was still predicted to cost around £2 million, a not insignificant amount of money. However, any concerns over budget were quickly brushed aside, as this would be a quick routine project that wouldn't take more than a couple years at most to complete. That, however, quickly changed. The project got caught in a web of delays, disputes over environmental impacts, accessibility standards, and planning rights. Work finally started in 2023, 10 years after the original project had been announced, and by that point the budget had more than tripled to over £10 million. And it wasn't until January 2025, 12 years on from its announcement, that it was finally completed. For the country which started the Industrial Revolution, this is a pretty dire record. It clearly doesn't have to be this hard to build things. Halfway across the world, China faced a nearly identical problem, but they managed to deal with it in just 43 hours. Of course, they do run one of the strongest authoritarian governments in the world, which makes it a lot easier to get stuff done. But the thing is, even among democracies, Britain is something of an exception. In the last decade, the average infrastructure project in the UK took almost twice as long to approve as those in Germany or France. Something's gone clearly very wrong here, and on the surface, it looks like Britain's construction industry is simply broken. But when you peel back the layers, you see this is exactly what's meant to happen. The supposedly broken system is working exactly as intended, just not for the people you might expect. It's easy to laugh at stories like Theale's bridge, but the truth is they're not exactly an exception. In the UK, just 0.2% of major projects are finished on time, and 73% run over budget. This is clearly a much bigger problem, one baked into the very way modern Britain works. To really understand why the system is so broken, it's helpful to take a look at what actually goes into getting approval to build anything. Imagine you're trying to construct a new railway station. You've secured the land, lined up funding, and somehow convinced the locals it'll all be worth the disruption. You open your laptop, expecting to find a checklist, a simple step-by-step guide for how to actually start building, but instead you find a labyrinth of paperwork, more than 20,000 pages of planning guidance, environmental regulations, and heritage protection laws, all written by different departments in slightly different legal dialects. There's the National Planning Policy Framework, Network Rail's design standards, building regulations, fire safety codes, environmental impact assessments, and about a dozen separate accessibility requirements. Now, to be fair, this isn't exactly unique to the UK. Pretty much every developed country has rules for how to build safely and sustainably, most of which began as well-intentioned efforts to make sure things actually worked. Bridges didn't collapse, stations didn't flood, and buildings didn't burn down. You know, the basics. But over time, those rules multiplied. Every time there was some safety incident, the solution was always to pile on another layer of regulation. Things have gotten so bad that the paperwork for a single infrastructure project will more often than not take longer than the actual construction itself. The application for Heathrow's third runway famously generated over 25,000 pages of documentation. To put that into perspective, if you were to stack all those pages on top of each other, the pile would stand taller than the runway is long. These mountains of paperwork required to get anything done have ended up creating entire industries of consultants, lawyers, and advisors whose full-time job is helping people navigate these insane bureaucracies. And of course, the harder the system is to understand, the more valuable their expertise becomes. The environmental and sustainability consulting market alone is estimated to be worth over £6 billion, which is nearly the same as the UK's entire music industry. It's created a kind of self-sustaining ecosystem, one that feeds on its own complexity without ever actually producing anything of value. Now, that might all sound pretty ridiculous. After all, it certainly isn't in the country's interests as a whole to make building anything difficult. But that's where things start to get a little more complicated, because while it might be bad for taxpayers, commuters, and anyone who actually wants new housing or infrastructure, it's been great for the people who already own it.
Deportation!
This phenomenon is so well documented that it's actually got its own name, NIMBYs, short for not in my backyard. Most of them tend to be middle class or affluent, which is why they're often described as the construction industry's version of a Karen. They come in all forms: environmentalists worried about green space, animal rights advocates protecting local habitats, heritage groups defending historic builders, or simply homeowners who don't want their morning view disrupted. On the surface, they're easy to mock, people who are opposed to change just for the sake of it. But the weird thing is, in most cases, they're not necessarily acting irrationally. Imagine you live in a small rural village in the southwest, and a developer comes along asking to build a massive block of new flats on the edge of town. All those extra flats would almost certainly bring down the value of your home, and add in the extra traffic, noise, and construction mess, and there's really little very upside for the homeowners at all. So local residents basically do whatever is in their power to stop development happening, creating some pretty ridiculous stories. A few years ago, a construction company wanted to convert an abandoned Victorian hospital into 291 apartments. Luckily for the locals, standing in the way was a 400-year-old mulberry tree. Any attempt to relocate the tree would risk killing it, at which point the East London Garden Society argued that this wasn't just any tree, it was a specially protected veteran tree. This ended up causing a massive delay, as the dispute went on for the local council to review and a series of environmental assessments had to be carried out. After a lengthy legal process, they finally allowed the developer to relocate the tree. Now, this is where things should have ended, but a couple weeks after this ruling, a local resident launched a legal challenge. This ended up going all the way to a high court, who ended up overturning the council's decision, blocking any development from taking place. So, nearly 7 years later, nothing had been built, and this kind of thing isn't a one-off. In the last decade, 16 major infrastructure projects faced legal challenges, but only one of them actually got passed. The other 15 were blocked, in most cases because local NIMBYs managed to get in the way. Part of the reason why this group has so much power compared to in other countries is because, well, there's just a lot more of them. Back in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher introduced a series of home ownership policies, most famously the Right to Buy scheme. The idea was that if working class families could own their own homes, they'd be less reliant on the state, instead building personal wealth through their properties. And in one sense, it worked. Home ownership soared to the second highest rate in the G7. The trouble is, that created a massive new group of people who were financially incentivized to block almost any new development. And the result has been some of the longest planning delays in the developed world. In fact, between 2010 and 2020, the average time to approve a major housing project doubled, rising to around 5 years on average, more than double Germany and 5 times that of France. Now, as tempting as it is to blame a certain Prime Minister from the 1980s, the reality is a bit more complicated. Yes, the UK has one of the highest home ownership rates in the Western world, but it's not entirely unique in that respect. Singapore, for instance, has managed to get more than 90% of its residents onto the property ladder, and unlike Britain, it managed to build entire new cities in less time it takes the UK to approve a single train station. So while widespread home ownership certainly hasn't helped, the deeper issue lies somewhere else, in a much more subtle but far more important feature of how the system was designed. This becomes pretty obvious when we take a closer look at the actual legal framework the UK uses to make these kind of planning decisions. The country's planning system is centred around a piece of legislation passed in 1947 called the Town and Country Planning Act. At the time, the country, particularly London, was busy rebuilding the nation after the Second World War. Because land was so cheap, it was a lot more profitable for developers to spread their buildings outwards rather than keeping them concentrated in city centres. The problem was that kind of urban sprawl risked putting massive pressure on already strained transport systems. These were the rail, roads and utilities that were still being patched back together after the war. So they passed this piece of legislation with the goal of effectively restricting how far cities could expand. Now, that might sound like it makes a lot of sense, and to be fair, for the time it did. The only problem is that nearly 80 years later, the same piece of legislation still dictates how most planning decisions in the UK are made. To put that into perspective, since the law was introduced, the UK's population has increased by almost 20 million people, from around 50 million in 1947 to nearly 70 million today. And every single year, it's still growing by roughly 300,000 to 400,000 people, more than an entire decade's worth of population growth back in the 1940s. Since then, the government has made some pretty significant attempts to change the rules around planning. In 2012, it created a new body called the Planning Inspectorate, designed to fast-track the biggest and most important projects. The idea was simple enough. If local councils were the bottleneck, just move the decision making up a level. Now, if you think that sounds a little weird to try and cut down on bureaucracy by effectively creating another layer, then you'd be right. The new body's first big test came with HS2, a flagship infrastructure project meant to connect London and Birmingham with a high-speed rail line, eventually extending further north to Manchester and Leeds. But it didn't take long for things to start to go wrong. Almost from day one, the project ran into a wall of objections. Entire communities went out to protest the route, forcing the government to run roughly a quarter of the route through tunnels, which are about 10 times expensive to build. Then came the environmental lobby, complaining about the disruption of local ecosystems. So, the government had to build an £100 million tunnel to protect a colony of just 300 bats. When HS2 was first given the green light back in 2012, it was projected to cost around £32.7 billion. Today, that number has gone up by more than 3 times, with completion not expected until 2030 at the earliest. Not exactly a roaring success for a body that was supposed to streamline the planning process. But the thing is, it's not exactly surprising either. Trying to fix a broken system of regulators by adding another regulator is a bit like trying to put out a fire by smothering it in oil. Actually taking steps towards fixing the country's broken planning system will require a lot more than any one piece of legislation. At the heart of the failure is really a much bigger question about what the government should actually be doing. Over the past few decades, its role has expanded into almost most areas of national life: housing, the environment, regional inequality, even urban design. Each one of those things on its own sounds reasonable, and in many ways they are, but the problems start when the government tries to do all of them at the same time. Every major project becomes a political balancing act, part infrastructure project, part social program, and part environmental plan, and in trying to satisfy everyone, it ends up satisfying no one. Ultimately, Britain's failure to build isn't just about inefficiency or poor management. It reflects a deeper institutional problem, one that's evolved over decades of layering competing goals and interests onto every aspect of governance. The original planning framework wasn't designed to handle the economic demands of the 21st century, yet instead of properly reforming it, successive governments have simply added more complexity in the hope of reconciling everything at once. Each new rule, consultation, and oversight body was meant to protect something valuable, but together they've created a system that often presents anything from being built at all. In many ways, what began as a sensible framework for oversight has gradually evolved into a system designed to remove all risk from public life, and in the process to protect the interests of those who already benefit from the status quo. Actually reversing this trend would require a government willing to question those assumptions, to accept that progress always involves some degree of risk, but that protecting everyone from change ultimately means protecting the country from changing at all. Britain's problem, in other words, isn't that it forgot how to build, it's that it built a system where doing so successfully became the exception rather than the rule.